few years ago I decided to try out Persona 3 after hearing good things about it for ages, and I was blown away. I played it non-stop for 3 months straight and finally completed it 120 hours later. Now, as much as I loved playing the game, what I saw of Persona 4 looked way more down my alley. The varied dungeons, the aesthetic, the character designs, everything looked like it was set to be an awesome experience. Of course, it's hard to not be enthralled by Persona 4 considering how much marketing it has, compared to 3 only now receiving an animated movie, while its sequel has already had 2 anime TV shows as well as countless more spin-off games than its predecessor. So, was I as fixated with Persona 4 as the rest of the world? No. 70 hours in, I finally dropped it. Admittedly, that was partly because I lost my save file, but regardless, I was playing the game at such a snail's pace because I just didn't have the same motivation that I had with 3. When comparing the two games and seeing what they respectively did good or bad and why, ultimately I think 3 succeeds where 4 fails. To try and show why I think this, we'll be looking at parts of the games piece by piece. One of the biggest things of a JRPG will obviously be the combat system, which Persona does very well, with it being simple enough to get into while also having enough depth for some fanatics of the genre to get their teeth stuck into. However, 4's combat absolutely blows 3 out of the water. While the mechanics of combat are essentially unchanged, with Persona Fusion and the same abilities being present, Persona 4 added the feature of direct command, and it's a pretty simple standard feature. It really does what it says, allowing you to take direct command of all your party members instead of just yourself. In 3, you could assign tactics to your members, telling them to support you in healing or defense, etc. This made for a lot of frustrating battles in 3, as when you really needed your designated healer to save your team from imminent death, they'd apply a buff or something instead, completely fucking you over. I still have PTSD over the final boss, where I died something like 17 times because Aegis refused to heal. Persona 4 does away with that, so if you lose a fight, it'll ultimately be your fault instead of poor AI. As I was saying before, I've always been one to care far more about the gameplay than the plot. I've always liked the appeal of strategy games and outsmarting your enemy in games like Civ 5 and Supreme Commander, but ultimately, I'm not smart enough to succeed in those games, which is why being able to take my own pace in RPGs at least allows me to pretend that I'm strategic. My favourite RPG series is Dragon Quest as a result, which has a pretty bare bones plot, but enough dungeons to keep me entertained. However, Persona 3 was the first game where the story kept me playing because of the character interactions. I think that the cast of 3, while at the first glance not looking like the most entertaining bunch, were far more interesting than those in 4 because of the way that their character development was done. Without any form of development to characters, the cast may seem fairly one-dimensional, and Persona 4 was very weird in how it introduced its characters. Normally, we get introduced to a character and get a general sense of their personality, whether it be that they're energetic, moody, or whatever. We'll learn about any kind of internal struggle they may have, they move past that, and grow from the experience as a result. In this game, however, the first time we meet the characters, the first thing we know about them is their insecurities through their shadow self. As a result, I have no interest in anything these characters are dealing with, and while they acknowledge the problems they face, it isn't entirely resolved. The big thing about the character's resolve in Persona is that when a character takes up a resolution, it's a big event, resulting in their persona being upgraded. In Persona 3, the characters get far more time spent on their resolution as it's directly connected to the plot, usually after a major event, which allows you to see each character's reaction to said event. In Persona 4, I can't deny that the cast don't have the same character development on the scale of 3, it's just far less accessible as it's done through social links, meaning it's impossible for every character to be fully fleshed out in a single playthrough. A huge chunk of Persona is the social aspect, as it's equally as important as grinding in dungeons, and I feel that 3 had the major plot points of the story implemented specifically with the character upgrades in mind, and the story is all the better for it. While neither game has the most memorable plot in the world, and neither did they need to, I'd say that Persona 3 had more memorable moments than 4. While they both had a mystery theme to them, 4's was mostly limited to the player wondering who the murderer could be, which didn't particularly grab my attention, while 3 had Tartarus, which did wonders for the game's grinding. Initially, I didn't like Tartarus. It was the only place you could grind in the game, and visually it was essentially the exact same throughout. However, as I progressed, I felt differently towards it. The idea of this huge 264 floor tower was reason enough for me to play it, as each time I felt like I was making progress to the top to see what the game had in store for me. The subtle music changes every 40 floors or so added this build up as I climbed higher and higher and got me more and more pumped for the inevitable conclusion to Tartarus. Initially, Persona 4's wide variety of dungeons seemed great, but once I had cleared them for the first time, replaying them for XP was a chore and nothing else. Apart from a mini-boss the first time you revisited, after that nothing was different and you fought monsters on the same 10 floors over and over and over. This meant that when there was a lull in the story and there needed to be a balance between social links and dungeons at night, I found the game very hard to play through during these points. And there is definitely a lull in the story in 4, perhaps too many given how slowly I felt the story progresses. 70 hours in, the biggest thing that I remember happening is that the supposed murderer was caught, until he was turned out to be a fake. 70 hours into Persona 3, Shinjiro died, which had interesting development for Makihiro, and Chidori died, which changed Junpei as a character. Two far more memorable moments with far greater impact. And even if I'm forgetting some big event that happened in 4, if it hasn't stuck with me despite me playing through 4 just 3 months ago compared to 3 in 2014, that speaks for itself. Credit where it's due, I did prefer 4's vibrant colour scheme to 3's moody blue colours. It's a small thing, but can ultimately go a long way considering the repetitive nature a game of this genre has. Both themes fit the games quite well, with the stakes being much larger in 3, and despite the whole serial killer thing, a lot of 4 is just goofs. The scale of each game's story is also somewhat represented in the environment it takes place in. 3 takes place in a city, while 4 takes place in a village, which doesn't really do it any favours. In 4 you'll be going around a limited area for social links, while 3 is far more variety in where you end up meeting people. This is entirely subjective, with nothing that can really back it up, but I found 3's social links to be far more engaging, with me really getting invested in the character's backstory. Whether it be Akanari and his reflection on life, or Bunkichi and Mitsuko trying to preserve their son's memory, there were very few I didn't like, the fat fuck Nozomi being one in particular. However, to 4's merit, as the cast's resolutions were implemented via social links, they were quite well done, and the game did produce one of my all-time favourite social links with Dojima. Overall, do I think Persona 4 is a bad game? Nah. At the end of the day, I did play it for ages, and if I didn't lose my save, I would have played it to completion eventually. The game seems to have looked at what makes other RPGs popular and tried to implement it into its own game, with the very dungeons and improved gameplay. However, I think somewhere along the lines it lost what made 3 so good in my eyes. In 3, the plot was really the centre focus, with everything being built around that, while 4 was built around the gameplay. I respect what it did, but it's ultimately not for me. This doesn't mean I'm turned off from the series though, as Persona 5 looks fantastic, from its lovely jazzy soundtrack, dungeons which don't just look like copy and pastes, and an interesting looking cast which 4 had going for it. With any luck I'll be making another video a year from now praising it as the best in the series, though it's got some big shoes to fill.